The world in the early 20th century was still reeling from the devastation of the First World War. Nations had barely begun to recover from the immense human and economic toll, and the fragile peace established by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was precarious at best. The treaty had imposed severe reparations on Germany, limited its military capabilities, and redrawn borders across Europe. For many Germans, it was a humiliating arrangement that fostered resentment, economic hardship, and political instability. It was against this backdrop of discontent and nationalistic fervor that one man rose to power: Adolf Hitler. Hitler's rise was rapid and dramatic. Through fiery speeches, propaganda, and promises to restore Germany's former glory, he gained support from a population desperate for change. By 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and shortly after, the Nazis consolidated power, eliminating political opposition and establishing a totalitarian regime. Hitler's ideology was based on the belief in the supremacy of the Aryan race, extreme nationalism, and a desire to expand German territory. These ideas were not only deeply racist, but also militaristic, setting the stage for global conflict. Meanwhile, other countries were grappling with their own problems. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, had embraced fascism and aimed to build a new Roman Empire. Japan, fueled by militaristic ambitions and a desire for natural resources, began expanding aggressively into China and Southeast Asia. Britain and France, scarred by the horrors of World War I, were reluctant to confront aggressor nations directly, favoring policies of appeasement. The League of Nations, established to prevent future wars, had proven ineffective at enforcing peace. The first significant act of aggression came in 1936, when Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. This bold move went largely unchallenged by France and Britain, emboldening Hitler. 2 years later, in 1938, Germany annexed Austria in what was known as the Anschluss. The international response remained muted, further signaling to Hitler that the major powers lacked the will to enforce limits. That same year, the Munich Agreement was signed, allowing Germany to take control of the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, in hopes of preventing a larger war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared it peace for our time, yet the agreement only postponed the inevitable. By 1939, Hitler's ambitions became impossible to ignore. He turned his attention to Poland, seeking to reclaim territories lost after World War I and to secure a corridor to the Baltic Sea. In August of that year, Hitler signed a shocking non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact stunned the world. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed not to attack each other and secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This agreement cleared the way for Hitler's invasion of Poland without fear of a Soviet intervention. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland using a new military strategy called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. This tactic relied on rapid movement, coordination between tanks, infantry, and air power, and overwhelming force to quickly crush opponents. Within weeks, Polish defenses collapsed, and the country was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The invasion prompted Britain and France to finally declare war on Germany on September 3, marking the official start of World War II. The early months of the war were dominated by what would later be called the Phony War. Along the Western Front, despite declarations of war, there was little fighting as both sides prepared their forces. Meanwhile, Germany consolidated its power in Poland, implemented harsh occupation policies, and began persecuting Jewish populations and political opponents. The world watched with a mix of fear and disbelief as Hitler's regime demonstrated both the efficiency of modern warfare and the cruelty of totalitarian rule. In the north, attention turned to Scandinavia. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, aiming to secure strategic ports and control access to the North Sea. Both countries fell quickly, and the German military demonstrated the effectiveness of combined air and sea operations. Meanwhile, the Western Allies were unprepared to mount a serious defense, revealing a lack of coordination and foresight. May 1940 marked a dramatic escalation in Western Europe. Germany launched a devastating offensive against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Using blitzkrieg tactics once again, German forces bypassed heavily fortified positions along the French Maginot Line and struck through the Ardennes forest, a region considered impassable by large armies. The speed and ferocity of the attack left Allied forces in disarray. Within weeks, Paris fell, and by June, France had surrendered. Britain, now standing alone against Germany, began preparing for a desperate defense of its homeland. While Europe burned, Hitler's ideological policies grew more radical. The Nazis intensified the persecution of Jews, Romani people, political dissidents, and other groups they considered undesirable. Ghettos were established, forced labor camps expanded, and the ominous plans that would later culminate in the Holocaust began taking shape. The world's attention was still largely focused on military campaigns, leaving many atrocities unchecked. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched the unfolding conflict with concern, but remained officially neutral. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, however, recognized the growing threat posed by Axis powers. Through policies like the Lend-Lease Act, the U.S. began supplying Britain and other allied nations with essential military aid, preparing for the possibility that America might eventually be drawn into the war. The seeds of a truly global conflict were being sown. As 1940 ended, the world stood at a crossroads. Germany dominated continental Europe. Britain fought alone against a powerful and aggressive enemy, and Axis ambitions in Asia and Africa were expanding. The stage was set for a war of unprecedented scale, where technological innovation, military strategy, and sheer human endurance would determine the fate of nations. The coming years would see battles that spanned continents, the rise and fall of empires, and the reshaping of global power structures. World War II was no longer a distant threat. It had arrived, and there would be no turning back. After the fall of France in June 1940, Britain found itself standing alone against the seemingly unstoppable might of Nazi Germany. The swift and overwhelming victories of Hitler's armies across the European continent had left the world in shock. Now, the German military turned its attention to Britain, intending to crush the island nation and secure control over Western Europe. The campaign that followed would become one of the most famous and decisive moments in World War II, the Battle of Britain. Adolf Hitler's strategy relied on a combination of aerial bombardment and a potential amphibious invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was tasked with establishing air superiority over southern England, destroying the Royal Air Force (RAF), and paving the way for an invasion. For months, German bombers and fighter planes launched attacks on British coastal towns, radar stations, and airfields. The Luftwaffe's initial targets were military installations, as Hitler believed crippling the RAF would ensure a smooth invasion. Britain, however, was far from defenseless. The RAF, though smaller in number, had a significant advantage in radar technology, allowing early detection of incoming German aircraft. Fighter Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, organized a highly effective system of air defense, combining radar stations, fighter squadrons, and ground observers. Pilots flying the iconic Spitfires and Hurricanes faced a relentless onslaught, engaging in dogfights with German Messerschmitts over the skies of England. The battle intensified in August and September of 1940, when the Luftwaffe shifted its focus to civilian areas, including London, Coventry, and other major cities. This period became known as the Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign intended to demoralize the British population. Thousands of civilians were killed or injured, and cities were reduced to rubble. Yet British morale remained surprisingly resilient. Prime Minister Winston Churchill became a symbol of determination, famously declaring, "We shall never surrender." His speeches inspired the nation to endure hardship and fight back against tyranny. Despite being outnumbered, the RAF achieved a remarkable victory. German losses mounted, and Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that air power could decisively influence the outcome of modern warfare, and that determination, strategy, and technology could overcome numerical superiority. It was the first major defeat for Hitler's forces, and it marked a turning point in the early stages of World War II. While Britain defended itself in the West, the Axis powers were also expanding in other parts of the world. In North Africa, Italian forces, under Benito Mussolini, sought to extend Italy's influence and gain control of strategic territories. However, Italy's military was poorly prepared for the harsh desert conditions and faced strong resistance from British and Commonwealth forces stationed in Egypt and Libya. The North African campaign quickly became a protracted struggle, with the British Eighth Army, led by General Archibald Wavell, mounting counterattacks to push back the Axis advance. In Eastern Europe, the non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union remained intact, but tensions were simmering beneath the surface. Hitler had long viewed Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union as prime targets for territorial expansion. Meanwhile, Stalin focused on consolidating Soviet influence over the Baltic states and parts of Poland. The uneasy alliance between the two totalitarian regimes was built on convenience rather than trust, and the stage was being set for future conflict on the Eastern Front. Across the Atlantic, the United States continued to monitor events with growing concern. Though officially neutral, the American government began to increase support for Britain through measures such as the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the U.S. to supply vital military equipment, aircraft, and naval vessels to allied nations. Roosevelt recognized that the survival of Britain was essential to preventing Axis domination in Europe. At the same time, he faced domestic opposition from isolationist voices who believed that America should avoid entanglement in foreign wars. In the Pacific, Japan's militaristic ambitions were accelerating. Seeking to dominate East Asia and secure critical resources such as oil, rubber, and minerals, Japan had already invaded parts of China, initiating a brutal and protracted conflict. Japanese forces committed widespread atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war, shocking the international community. The U.S. and other Western powers imposed economic sanctions, particularly restricting oil exports to Japan. These sanctions would later become a critical factor in Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor, drawing America fully into the global conflict. Back in Europe, Germany continued its aggressive expansion. In April 1941, Hitler turned his attention to the Balkans. Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece, facing unexpected resistance, but ultimately securing both countries. The invasions demonstrated the logistical and strategic capabilities of the Wehrmacht, while also exposing the vulnerabilities of smaller nations in the face of totalitarian aggression. Meanwhile, the British sent forces to Greece and North Africa to counter Axis advances, highlighting the growing complexity of a war that now spanned multiple continents. As 1941 unfolded, Hitler's ambitions reached new heights. He turned eastward, planning the largest military operation in history, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler's ideological goal was not only to conquer territory, but also to destroy Bolshevism and acquire Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. This operation would involve millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was a gamble that would have profound consequences for both Germany and the Soviet Union. At the same time, Britain struggled to maintain its position. The country faced shortages, bombed cities, and the constant threat of invasion. Yet British resilience and strategic leadership allowed the nation to survive, regroup, and plan for counteroffensives. The coordination between the military, civilians, and intelligence agencies played a critical role in sustaining morale and maintaining the ability to fight back. By the end of 1941, the war had evolved into a truly global conflict. Europe was partially under German control. North Africa was a contested battleground. The Soviet Union braced for an unprecedented invasion, and Japan expanded its empire in Asia. The United States, while not yet directly involved in combat, prepared to support the Allies and strengthen its military capabilities. The world was entering a period of total war, where nations mobilized entire populations, economies, and technologies in a struggle that would determine the future of humanity. The Battle of Britain, the North African campaigns, and the expanding theaters of conflict highlighted the multifaceted nature of World War II. The war was no longer a series of isolated battles. It had become a complex network of campaigns spanning continents, oceans, and ideologies. Courage, strategy, innovation, and sheer endurance would define the outcome of the coming years. The stage was set for even greater clashes, from the icy plains of the Eastern Front to the tropical islands of the Pacific. By mid-1941, World War II had escalated into a conflict of unprecedented scale. Germany had secured much of Western Europe, Britain continued to resist in the West, and Japan expanded its empire in Asia. Yet Adolf Hitler's ambitions were far from satisfied. His ideological and strategic eyes turned eastward toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union, a nation he regarded as both an ideological enemy and a source of Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, poured across the Soviet border along a front stretching over 2,000 miles. The initial objectives were to capture key cities, Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and the oil-rich Caucasus region in the south, and to crush the Soviet Union before winter set in. Hitler believed that the Soviets were weak, poorly led, and vulnerable to a lightning strike. The early weeks of the invasion were devastating for the Red Army. German forces employed blitzkrieg tactics with terrifying efficiency. Armored divisions tore through front lines, motorized infantry followed to secure territory, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Soviet forces were often encircled, leading to massive losses in manpower and equipment. Entire towns fell within days, and millions of civilians were caught in the chaos of advancing armies. Despite initial setbacks, Soviet resistance proved far stronger than Hitler had anticipated. Stalin, initially taken by surprise, ordered a scorched earth policy. Factories were dismantled and relocated eastward, crops and infrastructure were destroyed to deny resources to the invaders. Millions of Soviet citizens were mobilized for the war effort, working in factories, digging trenches, and supplying the front lines. Soviet partisans also began guerrilla operations behind German lines, sabotaging supply routes and communications. The campaign's brutality extended beyond the battlefield. Nazi policies in occupied Soviet territories were characterized by mass executions, forced labor, and extreme violence against civilians. Jews, political dissidents, and other targeted groups were subjected to systematic persecution, foreshadowing the horrors of the Holocaust. Entire villages were destroyed, and the Eastern Front became a theater of both military and human devastation. As German forces advanced, they encountered logistical challenges that would ultimately slow their momentum. The vastness of Soviet territory, poor road networks, and the onset of the infamous Russian winter strained supply lines. Soldiers faced freezing temperatures, inadequate clothing, and dwindling food, leading to severe casualties. Hitler's insistence on rapid advancement often ignored military realities, creating tension between strategic objectives and operational capacity. Meanwhile, Britain sought to capitalize on German overextension. British forces, supported by Commonwealth troops, launched counterattacks in North Africa under the leadership of General Bernard Montgomery. The North African campaign intensified, with battles such as El Alamein becoming pivotal. Control of Egypt and the Suez Canal was crucial for maintaining access to Middle Eastern oil and trade routes, making North Africa a key theater in the global conflict. Across the Atlantic, the United States had been preparing for eventual involvement. President Franklin D. Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union in 1941, recognizing that the Eastern Front had become critical in weakening Nazi Germany. American supplies of aircraft, tanks, and food bolstered Soviet resistance, even as the United States remained officially neutral. Economic and military preparation for potential direct involvement continued, particularly in response to Japanese aggression in the Pacific. In December 1941, the global conflict reached a new dimension. Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the American naval base in Hawaii. The assault destroyed much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, killing over 2,400 personnel and crippling battleships and aircraft. The attack shocked the world and ended any remaining isolationist sentiment in the United States. On December 8th, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and shortly thereafter, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, bringing America fully into the global conflict. The entry of the United States into the war had immediate strategic implications. American industrial capacity, manpower, and technological innovation would provide crucial support to Allied forces in both Europe and the Pacific. At the same time, the Pacific theater became a major front, as the United States and its allies sought to counter Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands. Battles in the Coral Sea and Midway would soon demonstrate that naval and air power were central to modern warfare. Back in the Soviet Union, the Battle of Moscow became a defining moment of the Eastern Front. In late 1941, German forces approached the Soviet capital, confident that victory was imminent. Yet the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, bolstered by fresh reserves, harsh winter conditions, and fierce urban resistance. German troops, unprepared for the brutal Russian winter and overstretched by supply shortages, suffered devastating losses. The failure to capture Moscow marked Hitler's first major setback in the East and demonstrated that the Soviet Union would not collapse easily. By the end of 1941, World War II had truly become a global struggle. Europe was engulfed in conflict, North Africa remained contested, the Soviet Union was fighting for survival, and the United States had entered the war on multiple fronts. Axis ambitions were facing significant resistance, and the Allies were beginning to coordinate efforts across continents. Yet the scale of destruction and human suffering continued to grow, as cities were bombed, civilians were displaced, and millions of soldiers and civilians alike faced unimaginable hardships. The events of 1941 set the stage for the next phase of the war. The Eastern Front would become the site of some of the largest and bloodiest battles in human history, testing the endurance and resolve of both German and Soviet forces. In the Pacific, naval and air engagements would determine control of strategic territories and resources. The global balance of power was shifting, and the outcome of World War II was far from certain. Courage, sacrifice, and innovation would be tested on an unprecedented scale, shaping the course of the 20th century. By 1942, World War II had reached a critical juncture. The Axis powers still held vast territories in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, but cracks were beginning to show in their seemingly unstoppable expansion. Germany's offensive in the Soviet Union had slowed. Japan had overstretched its reach across Asia and the Pacific, and the United States, fully engaged in the war, had begun to mobilize its immense industrial and military capacity. The stage was set for a series of battles that would mark a turning point in the global conflict. In the East, the Battle of Stalingrad became the defining clash between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1942, Hitler sought to seize the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, both to secure vital oil fields in the Caucasus and to deal a symbolic blow to Soviet morale. German forces, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, advanced into the city, expecting a swift victory. Instead, they encountered determined Soviet resistance under General Vasily Chukov, who employed a strategy known as hugging the enemy, keeping Soviet troops close to German forces to nullify the effectiveness of Luftwaffe bombing and artillery. The battle quickly turned into a brutal urban struggle. Stalingrad streets became a labyrinth of fighting, with every building, factory, and block fiercely contested. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and starvation, disease, and constant bombardment compounded the suffering. German forces were initially able to advance, but became entangled in a protracted battle of attrition. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German Sixth Army. Surrounded and cut off from supplies, the Germans faced a harsh winter and an unyielding enemy. Despite Hitler's orders to fight to the last man, Paulus ultimately surrendered in February 1943, marking the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht and a turning point on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the tide was also beginning to shift. After the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had rapidly expanded across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore. However, the Allies, particularly the United States and Australia, were regrouping. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway proved decisive. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications, revealing the date and location of Japan's planned attack. Armed with this knowledge, the U.S. Navy prepared an ambush. The result was a stunning victory. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, while the U.S. lost only 1. Midway halted Japanese expansion and shifted the strategic initiative in the Pacific to the Allies. In North Africa, the struggle for control continued with fierce battles between Axis and Allied forces. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, had achieved remarkable successes, threatening British positions in Egypt and the Suez Canal. Yet the Allies, reinforced by American and Commonwealth troops, launched counteroffensives at key locations, including the pivotal Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942. Led by General Bernard Montgomery, the Allies broke through Rommel's defenses, forcing German and Italian forces into retreat across Libya. Control of North Africa would prove essential for the subsequent Allied invasion of Italy and the Mediterranean campaign. The strategic situation in Europe also began to change with the Allied bombing campaigns. British and American bombers targeted German industrial centers, transportation networks, and oil facilities. These raids, though costly, disrupted German production and forced Hitler to divert resources to homeland defense. The cumulative effect of these campaigns weakened Germany's war machine and demonstrated the growing technological and logistical advantage of the Allies. In 1943, the Soviets launched a series of offensives following the victory at Stalingrad, gradually reclaiming territory lost to the Germans. The Battle of Kursk, fought in July 1943, became the largest tank battle in history. German forces attempted to encircle Soviet troops in a pincer movement, but well-prepared Soviet defenses and massive counterattacks led to a decisive Soviet victory. From this point onward, the Red Army gained the strategic initiative, pushing the Germans westward in a relentless advance that would continue until the fall of Berlin in 1945. In Italy, the Allies launched operations to weaken Axis control and open a southern front in Europe. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily, capturing the island after weeks of intense fighting. The success of the Sicilian campaign led to the overthrow of Benito Mussolini and Italy's eventual surrender in September 1943. German forces, however, continued to resist, establishing defensive positions in northern Italy and prolonging the conflict in the region. These campaigns showcased the growing coordination and effectiveness of Allied combined operations across multiple theaters. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Allied forces began a campaign of island hopping, strategically capturing key islands to move closer to Japan. Battles such as Guadalcanal tested the resolve of American and Australian troops, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Control of the seas, the skies, and supply lines became critical, highlighting the importance of naval and air superiority in modern warfare. Japanese forces, overstretched and facing logistical challenges, were gradually pushed back, signaling the beginning of a long and grueling retreat. By the end of 1943, the momentum of the war had shifted. Axis forces, once seemingly invincible, were being systematically worn down on multiple fronts. The Soviet Union was advancing in the east. The Allies had gained a foothold in Italy, North Africa was secure, and the United States was increasingly dominant in the Pacific. Technological innovation, intelligence breakthroughs, and effective coordination among Allied nations played a crucial role in reversing the fortunes of war. The year also highlighted the human cost of the conflict. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died, cities lay in ruins, and the full scale of atrocities, including the systematic extermination of Jews and other targeted groups, was becoming known. The moral and psychological dimensions of the war were as significant as the military campaigns themselves, shaping public perception and the resolve of nations. The victories at Stalingrad, Midway, and El Alamein marked more than just military successes. They symbolized the resilience and determination of nations under threat. They demonstrated that Axis powers were not invincible, and that coordinated, strategic, and sustained efforts could change the course of history. The Allies were no longer merely resisting. They were beginning to take the fight to the enemy, setting the stage for the eventual liberation of occupied territories and the final defeat of the Axis powers. As 1943 drew to a close, the world was poised on the brink of a new phase of conflict. The coming years would witness massive offensives, the liberation of occupied lands, and decisive battles that would determine the fate of Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. The Axis, once dominant, now faced the combined strength, strategy, and resilience of the Allied nations. Courage, sacrifice, and determination would continue to shape the path of the world, as the ultimate struggle for freedom, survival, and justice intensified on every front. By 1944, World War II had reached its climactic phase. The Allies had gained momentum on multiple fronts, steadily eroding the strength of the Axis powers. In the West, Britain and the United States had been building up forces in preparation for a decisive strike against Nazi-occupied Europe. In the East, the Soviet Union had pushed deep into Eastern Europe, reclaiming territory and moving inexorably toward Germany itself. The stage was set for the final series of battles that would bring the long and devastating conflict to an end. The most significant of these operations was D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Codenamed Operation Overlord, it was the largest amphibious assault in history. Over 156,000 troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations crossed the English Channel, landing on 5 beaches along the coast of Normandy, France. The operation required meticulous planning, including deception strategies to mislead German forces about the intended landing sites. Paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt defenses, while massive naval and air bombardments targeted German fortifications. Despite fierce German resistance, the Allies secured the beaches and began pushing inland. The fighting was intense, with heavy casualties on both sides. Yet the operation succeeded in establishing a crucial foothold in Western Europe, allowing Allied forces to advance through France, liberate Paris in August 1944, and open a second front against Germany. D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi occupation in Western Europe and demonstrated the power of coordinated military strategy and international cooperation. While the Allies advanced from the West, the Soviet Union continued its relentless push from the East. Cities across Eastern Europe were liberated from German control, often at enormous cost. Battles such as the Vistula-Oder offensive in early 1945 brought Soviet forces to the outskirts of Germany, while civilians endured the hardships of occupation, artillery bombardments, and displacement. The Eastern Front had become a theater of total war, with millions of soldiers and civilians suffering unimaginable losses. In Germany itself, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Allied bombing raids had destroyed much of the country's infrastructure, severely limiting its capacity to continue the war. Fuel shortages, logistical breakdowns, and mounting casualties weakened the Wehrmacht. Hitler, increasingly isolated and delusional, refused to surrender, ordering futile counterattacks and prolonging the suffering of both his army and German civilians. Cities across Germany faced relentless bombing and artillery fire as Allied forces advanced from multiple directions. By April 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. The Battle of Berlin was fierce and destructive, with street-to-street fighting that left the city in ruins. Adolf Hitler, facing inevitable defeat, committed suicide on April 30, 1945, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Shortly thereafter, on May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered, bringing the war in Europe to an end. The victory was hard-won, but it marked the collapse of the Nazi regime and the liberation of millions from occupation and tyranny. In the Pacific, the war continued against Japan. Allied forces pursued a strategy of island hopping, gradually capturing strategic islands and moving closer to the Japanese mainland. Battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa were extraordinarily bloody, demonstrating the tenacity of Japanese defense and the high cost of victory. The use of kamikaze attacks underscored Japan's determination, even in the face of impending defeat. To bring the war to a swift conclusion, the United States made the controversial decision to deploy atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The unprecedented destruction and loss of life compelled Japan to surrender unconditionally on August 15, 1945, officially signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. The war in the Pacific was over, bringing World War II to a definitive close after 6 years of global conflict. The human cost of the war was staggering. Tens of millions of soldiers and civilians had died, entire cities had been destroyed, and economies were devastated. The Holocaust had resulted in the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, alongside millions of other targeted groups, leaving an indelible scar on human history. Yet, amidst the destruction, the war also revealed extraordinary acts of courage, resilience, and solidarity among people across the world. The aftermath of World War II reshaped the global order. Europe was left in ruins, prompting initiatives like the Marshall Plan to rebuild economies and prevent the spread of totalitarian regimes. The United Nations was established in 1945 to foster international cooperation and prevent future global conflicts. Politically, the war set the stage for the Cold War, as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union grew over spheres of influence and ideological differences. World War II also accelerated technological and social change. Military innovations, including radar, jet engines, nuclear weapons, and advanced medical techniques, had far-reaching implications. The role of women in the workforce expanded, as they took on critical jobs in factories, offices, and military support services during the war. These changes had lasting effects, influencing society long after the guns fell silent. Ultimately, World War II was a defining moment in human history. It was a conflict driven by ideology, ambition, and the struggle for survival. It showcased the extremes of human cruelty and the heights of bravery, the horrors of genocide, and the sacrifices required for freedom. The Allied victory preserved nations from totalitarian domination and laid the foundation for a new international order. But the lessons of the war, about vigilance, humanity, and the cost of global conflict, remain enduring reminders for generations to come. The world, scarred yet determined, emerged from the shadows of World War II with a renewed commitment to peace, reconstruction, and international collaboration. Nations learned that freedom and democracy were precious, and that the price of maintaining them was vigilance, unity, and the courage to resist tyranny. Though the guns were silenced, the legacy of World War II continued to shape the political, social, and cultural landscape of the 20th century and beyond.